UK, USA, tax talk and more from Collyer Bristow. Welcome to the latest episode in the Collyer Bristow series, UK, USA. On today's episode, Senior Associate Aidan Grant is joined by Kristopher Heck and Patrick Mulhern of Tanager Wealth Management. Together they discuss financial planning and wealth management for US citizens living in the UK. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second episode of Collyer Bristow's US-UK podcast, a series designed to help break down the complexities of US and UK private wealth matters into more digestible morsels. If you haven't had the chance to listen to our first episode on pre-immigration planning for Americans coming to the UK, then please do go and have a listen. It was a good discussion with my colleague Charlie Fowler about the interaction between tax and immigration issues for those looking to relocate to the UK. Let that but be the starter to this main course, another nutritious and hearty serving of US-UK private wealth discussion. And I promise to my guest today, I won't be making any more food idioms. The discussion topic to today is US-UK financial planning and wealth management, and I'm delighted to be joined by Kristopher Heck and Patrick Mulhern of Tanager Wealth Management, who will be guiding us on this journey today, looking at questions like why financial planning is so important for Americans living overseas and particularly in the UK, and what do those individuals with feet in each territory need to know about structuring their investments and finances so to be tax and reporting efficient in both jurisdictions. If these are questions that have weighed heavy on your mind, then hopefully this episode will offer some enlightenment and illumination, and hopefully it will be interesting as well. Before asking my guests to introduce themselves, just a really quick background to me again. My name is Aidan Grant. I'm a senior associate here at Collyer Bristow in the private wealth department. I sit in our tax and estate planning team advising high net worth individuals on a broad range of tax and estate planning matters, including domestic and offshore taxation, trusts, wills, lifetime estate planning, and so on. But for the purposes of this episode here, one of my focuses is on advising high net worth Americans living both in the UK and the US about UK tax and estate planning matters, helping to navigate them through the UK issues, but with a US conscience, an eye on the US tax issues. Kristopher, Patrick, perhaps you might introduce yourselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, Aidan. It's very kind of you to have us on the show today. My name is Kristopher Heck, and I set up Tanager with a few other fantastic partners about 8 or 9 years ago. And it was really just looking at our own challenges, as all the advisors at Tanager are American expats or dual citizens themselves, and really trying to deliver a service that we thought was missing in the marketplace that would really look at a way to create an optimal solution for a transatlantic family's financial situation, helping them achieve their goals, whatever they might be, whether it's philanthropic or whether it's financial or whether it's just simply paying for school fees. Whatever it might be, and to do it in an absolutely efficient manner. So that generally encompasses financial planning, estate planning, of course, with external professionals who know that, and investment management that's very, very tax efficient, and working alongside the team of experts that we put together for clients. Again, that would include perhaps a US-UK qualified accountant, US and UK qualified estate planning attorneys, maybe insurance professionals, et cetera, to really make sure that we're delivering a plan that was optimal. And that was something I just couldn't find myself when I moved over here working with a large institutional asset manager 10, 12 years ago.
That's Kristopher. Patrick, and yourself?
I'm Patrick Mulhern. I'm one of the financial advisors and partners at Tanager. I provide financial advice and financial planning for the expats and US connected people that make up our core clients. So just like Kristopher said, whether it's going to be taking care of people who have recently come over or perhaps are thinking about coming over to the UK and are thinking about how to structure and plan for that, all the way through to clients and multi-generational families who've been here for 20, 30, 40, 50 years and dealing with the complex myriad ways that things can get complicated when you're dealing with both jurisdictions. Yeah, also as everyone else at Tanager is, on a personal note, I was born and raised in the US, in New Hampshire, and made the fateful and ultimately excellent decision to marry my wife, who's from London, and we've been living and working back and forth between the two countries since 2003.
I imagine, picking up on the point that you made, Kristopher, that it should come as some consolation and comfort to your clients that you practice what you preach. The custodian of one's own affairs. One guards one's own house particularly strongly, and so if you know how to guard your own house, you're probably better at guarding other people's houses as well.
Absolutely, and we've seen it all and we've lived it all. generally speaking. As Patrick said, I'm also married to a non-American, a British woman who made the fateful choice to marry me and have several dual citizen children. So our own household is quite mixed in terms of tax and financial ramifications. And we eat our own cooking. So these are solutions that we're using and deploying for our own families and our own children, our own spouses who may or may not be Americans themselves.
I was going to go on and say, let's have a fact pattern, or at least a broad sort of loose idea about a client that we might deal with. But really, I should have said, let's just imagine a Tanager employee, because it sounds like an American coming to the UK, marrying a Brit, and they're having dual citizen children is kind of de rigueur for Tanager. But yeah, let's keep them a client, just in case we want to refer to these people. Let's imagine a wealthy American. Let's call her Mrs. Jones for simplicity. She comes to the UK. She marries a UK citizen, and they've got a couple of dual citizen children. For the time being, she's been here for a few years, but her facts might change as we need them to for the purposes of our examples. And let's say they've got some liquid assets in both countries for the time being, and they're coming to you because they've heard great things about Tanager, and they want to know what it is that they should be doing now as regards various parts of the financial planning environment. To that point, there are 4 or 5, let's say, broad things we're going to touch on today, or we hope to touch on today. Tangents may take us in different directions. Firstly, we're going to look at really broad investment strategies, broad themes for US-UK clients. What are the fundamental things that Mrs. Jones and people like Mrs. Jones need to know when they come to a financial planner for the first time as an American in the UK? What are just the absolute basic principles that they have to abide by? Then looking further into the financial planning, what does that planning involve? How do we set up a strategy? What about if those strategies involve a particular style of investment, such as ESG? Then looking at perhaps some common products, or perhaps some of the most common things people might come to planners like Tanager, things like pensions, things like setting up, putting aside money for your children for the future, and how that money should be invested and grow in the future for children. And then looking at the very end, if we have the time, to 2 final issues. One, what are some of the most common issues that you guys see that if you could let people know to not come to you with, or rather come to you with before they have the problem? What are some of those common pitfalls? And if they have the decision to come to you before they come to the UK, why is coming to you before they've arrived perhaps slightly better than doing it regrettably, as Mrs. Jones has done here, and come to you while she's already resident? So that is a brief sketch through. It sounds like a lot. We will make it as digestible and fun and interesting and enjoyable as possible. But to channel Julie Andrews, as I did in the previous podcast, let's start at the beginning. A very good place to start. General investment strategies. I mean, as you may well both know, I am an expatriated American citizen myself, so I probably wouldn't come to Tanager anymore. But let's say I had turned up at your doorsteps 3 years ago with let's say an inheritance, and I'd said, I am an American citizen living in the UK, and I've just inherited a load of money in the US. What do I need to know?
That's a very good place to start. Absolutely. So what you would need to know is the ultimate question really needs to be, how do I be efficient in my financial affairs? And I will probably say that word efficient 10 times on this podcast. Patrick may say it another 10 times. And that's really what you have to get to. Because we could certainly go in and talk about every single nuance and nook and cranny of tax code and financial planning code and how insurance works and the investments you need. But the biggest thing is just understanding, how do I be efficient myself and achieve the goals that I'm trying to achieve, which maybe is raising 2 children and putting them through school and paying for college potentially, or helping with down payments, your own personal retirement. Maybe it's quitting your job in 3 years and setting up a business, whatever goals you might have, and understanding the ramifications of how to be efficient when achieving those goals. One of the big things, if you're receiving perhaps an inheritance, as you teed up just a second ago, is to understand what's inside of that. Did you inherit a trust, or what's outside of it? Is it inside of a trust? Well, we really need to get an estate planning attorney to help us unpick the US and UK tax ramifications of a trust that you might be beneficiary of at this point in time. And understanding that and laying the ground rules of what you can and can't do and what you should and shouldn't do in managing that trust are really important to get right up front. The 2 countries have different rules and taxation on trusts and what can be inside them, and what triggers might cause an adverse, unintended consequence, particularly when it relates to tax. So understanding what form is the inheritance. Is it a trust, or is it just a blank, a check that you're depositing?
I imagine that could be several podcast episodes in themselves, and we may well come back to that with you guys or with some other people looking at inheritances out of trust and indirectly. I wish we had time to sit on that today. But you're right. That is as from the attorney, from the lawyer's side, that is absolutely one of the first questions we would be asking, and indeed we have asked many times before. Let's assume that it's a direct inheritance out of the estate. They've gone through US probate. It's been painful. It's been horrible. They just want to put it behind them now. But it's been a direct inheritance.
Fantastic. Well, given that grand simplification, we can understand, what exactly have you inherited? Is it just cash in a bank account? That would be fantastic. There's probably little to worry about on day one from having cash in a bank account. Or did it in fact contain a lot of American mutual funds or exchange traded funds? And the challenge would be that if you inherited this via the US, it was probably managed by an advisor in the US that took care only with respect to US rules and US taxes and US regulations. In fact, now we really have to think about the second country, which for many of our clients is the UK, and then of course the HMRC taxation of those products inside. And you may very well have inherited something that's going to be absolutely terrible for your HMRC tax return. And we need to understand, what basis do you have that, and can we get out of it sooner rather than later, such that we can mitigate the tax challenges that might arise going forward.
Because Patrick, I think the sort of the reason we're at this position currently, is it not? Because the US, and it sounds obvious to say it, but it is the thing that underpins everything that, frankly, this podcast is designed to look at, which is the US and the UK just have different rules. And there will be investments, instruments, products that one country has decided it wants to offer a tax incentive on, or doesn't require reporting in a particular way, but that isn't mirrored in the other country. And there will no doubt be examples that we'll come to later in this episode. But that is the underpinning, is it not, of why we have these issues. You need to basically watch both sides of the both sides of the path to make sure you don't fall off either side.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think that some of the core things to bear in mind is just the fact that, as you say, the things that are right for your neighbors, if you're living here in the UK, that some of the simple strategies they're going to be thinking about of possibly opening some forms of savings accounts and getting ready for the future, the way that they've seen on advertisements on the tube possibly, or simple things that are offered by high street banks, may be far, far, far more complicated because of the US connection, because of the US citizenship and lifelong taxation to the IRS than they're anticipating. And needing to think about that and structure that before they go off and take some form of action is really, really critical. I think that's why financial planning pays such dividends in this space, is because if you start by saying, let's take the Hippocratic approach and first do no harm, let's stop before we take any action, then we'll have an outcome here where you've avoided some of the pitfalls because you haven't just run off and done the things that looked good on paper, but maybe you just didn't appreciate the ways that's going to trigger an issue in one country or the other. As Chris said, often that's the UK that we're thinking about, but as often as not, it's the US that's being triggered in a way that somebody resident here in the UK just wasn't anticipating.
And indeed, it's not necessarily that there may be, in a given scenario, there may be more tax due. The tax position could be the same, but it could just be the way in which that particular investment or the income or the gains on it are reported are just different. And you may be in no worse tax position, but your accountants and your wealth managers are not going to thank you if you have sort of ill thought out investments, or, investments that don't suit an American living in the UK, because they've got to go through and they've got to record every single line of investments, in a way in one country than another country. It's a collective investment, and so it's just dealt with as a whole. It's important to, I think, make that point as well. That is probably what causes the most concern for the accountants of investment portfolios that are not managed correctly, is that reporting, not necessarily the tax. We, of course, will come on to the tax.
No, that's a fantastic point. The reporting is so important here. We've seen clients, give their accountants from their previous advisors, 12 months worth of printed out statements from the large brokerage firm in the US and say, here you go, here's every transaction that happened. And the accountants, I imagine, would just throw their hands up in the air and go, oh my God, this is going to take 15 hours to unpick and to at least get it into a spreadsheet where I can start to manipulate the information. We've spent a lot of time thinking about our dual currency reporting and trying to translate one account into the other country. Because you don't have to think too much about US tax reporting for a US brokerage account. It's probably built into the US brokerage accounts, normal operational framework. But you do have to think about your HMRC reporting. And the other way around, if you have a UK account or a non-US account, the reporting for that country is probably built into the infrastructure of that account, but it's not going to spit out IRS reporting for you that you need for the US. So we spend a lot of time trying to give back our clients a few Saturday afternoons and to make their accountants and estate planning attorneys' lives a bit more sane, so they can have a summarized printout of their accounts for each country.
I mean, on behalf of estate planning attorneys, we thank you. Presumably, so we referenced Mrs. Jones, who is an American who's married to a non-American. Presumably, and this starts to push it into the second topic about what are some of the things that we need to think about from an investment planning perspective. Presumably, an American as a sole individual here in the UK has different options open to them compared to an American married to another American, which is different to an American married to a non-American. Because if you have a non-American, you've now got one spouse who is inside the US tax and reporting regime, and one spouse who is not going to be in it. Does that pose a difficulty for you, or does that pose more opportunity for you?
I always need to think about the spouses and the different combinations of citizenships that we can end up with. There are limitations when we're dealing with a U.S. citizen who's married to a non-American, what the U.S. typically calls a non-resident alien, an NRA, right? Someone who's not living in the U.S., someone who's not an American citizen, but still all the same, they're at least tangentially connected here because they are married to an American. There is some planning implications that comes from the financial planner's perspective to get that optimized. And yes, Chris, even dare I say efficient, is a good word for it. And there are some limitations we always have to be mindful of when we're starting to work through the plan, as you know well, right? Gifting between spouses, which is something that most married folks probably don't think of as a concept. Giving assets back and forth between bank accounts or just in general isn't something most married people are used to thinking about as something they even would keep track of. But there are some limitations about how much can be gifted between spouses that need to be tracked and borne in mind if we're executing a financial plan. And we can definitely go deeper into that. But the inverse of that is for sure the opportunity side. There are lots of opportunities that come from ring fencing assets around the non-American spouse in the household. So they can take some of the household's wealth and utilize strategies that would otherwise pose problems in the US. So the classic example of that is always going to be an ISA, which gives tax-free status for the investments inside. So we can grow some piece of the couple's wealth without having to worry about the way the IRS might tax investments inside of an ISA, which, as we've already at least touched on tangentially, is all of the problems of reporting and taxation issues that comes from not planning ahead and going off, if you're an American citizen, and investing inside of an ISA, creating yourself a world of issues that need to be unpacked effectively right from the beginning of doing a financial plan.
I mean, we see the same thing happening less with liquid investments as the lawyers, but with, say, the main residence as well, where you have a main residence held between Mrs. Jones and her husband, American, non-American, that you've got one spouse who's inside the US tax net, one spouse who isn't. That means that there is the potential for the IRS to try and take a chunk of the capital gains of the house in the hands of the American, whereas they won't in the hands of the non-American. Matrimonial issues aside, having your house in the name of the non-American gives you the opportunity to not pay the IRS for your capital gains that they will still levy because the IRS don't offer as generous an allowance on the main residence. That we can come back to probably on another podcast, but it is an example of this all-pervasive nature of what am I holding in one name? What am I holding in the other name? Clearly, for some spouses, it might be easier. They want to hold everything jointly because it's convenient for them and because that has to be the way that matters are structured. However, for those couples that are secure and stable in their relationships, the opportunity to subdivide and think carefully about who holds has to be a really important issue, Kristopher.
Yeah, and there's opportunities on the US side too. For example, owning real estate in the US, you kind of have the opposite problem. You don't necessarily want the non-resident alien to own the family vacation home in California or Florida or what have you. It might be more efficient for lots of legal and tax reasons to have the American own it. So to work the other way, if you do have a second home in the US, it's probably better to have an American in the family somehow so that they can own that particular property. We also find that when you are investing, that things tend to be a lot more efficient in America. I mean, say what you will about American culture and society, but it's definitely capitalist. And so the capital markets in the US are just much more efficient than the rest of the world. And I would estimate you can save probably half of the fees of operating an account in the UK or in the EU by having a US brokerage account or US investment account, whether it's the cost of the products you might invest in or the trading charges or the annual custody charges or the bank fees or the foreign exchange fees, whatever it might be. actually having someone with access to the US capital markets that is a US citizen actually makes your overall financial wealth a lot more efficient. So there are some plus sides to being an American as well.
I was going to say, just quickly jumping in. We are not necessarily. Well, I mean, I can't because I'm not qualified to give investment advice. I don't imagine you're advocating that every British person listening to this podcast immediately goes and opens a brokerage account in America, because that brings with it many other issues. But if you are an American and it makes sense for you to invest in America, there are certainly administration advantages to it. No, absolutely, I agree.
There are lots of opportunities. Another one is Americans have the opportunity to do something that's called a Roth conversion, where you effectively turn your pension into an ISA, to put it in British parlance. And so now you've taken your tax deferred and income taxable when you take distributions account and make it tax free forever. And that's quite powerful, to turn your pension into a tax free account, even on distribution. So again, there are lots of these little niches and tricks that can be accomplished by having a foot on each side of the Atlantic. And what we actually find, not just personally, as Patrick and I mentioned, are both married to non-Americans, but also in the financial sense, it's better to have one of each. And that's what we find. Probably 2/3 of our clients are mixed nationality households. So we're quite au fait with dealing with the challenges of planning for a mixed nationality household, and not just ignoring one member of the household or the other. I would imagine if you went to a British-only financial advisor, they might say, okay, we'll put all the assets in the name of the British person. Or if you go to an American advisor in America, they say, oh, put all the assets in the American's name. Actually, that's not quite the right solution. It's probably optimal to have a little bit in each.
UK, USA, tax talk and more from Collyer, Bristow.
You mentioned about dealing with the challenges of having different spouses and how to put things in different spouses' names. Thinking about sort of the second of our topics, that challenge, how does that challenge become more difficult, or how does that challenge pose greater opportunities when your hands are sort of tied further behind your backs by the client? For example, in the example I gave at the top of the podcast episode introduction, is particularly interested in ethical investing or in ESG investing. I will accept. I know that the E stands for environmental, and I can understand how you have an environmental sort of focused investment strategy. I don't quite understand what a social or governance-based investment strategy is. Maybe you guys might enlighten me. But how does that work? Do you find that kind of engagement by a client is yet more engaging because it means that you have the opportunity to ever focus down their planning, or is that just one more set of handcuffs around your wrists that prevent you from engaging fully with the opportunities available?
Oh, not at all. It's a fantastic opportunity, and we've listened to our clients' feedback and indeed our own personal and professional beliefs. And we've been providing ESG solutions for quite some time now, and really trying to take into account what the investor's preferences are, and understanding how do you overlay that into a custom bespoke portfolio that exactly tailored to what their own, I guess, moral money beliefs might be. Some people might really, really care about the environment, but don't actually care about Facebook's data privacy concerns that people might have. Other people, maybe IT professionals, are really, really concerned about Facebook's IT, data privacy rules and regulations, and Cambridge Analytica's challenges and whatnot. So actually, everyone's a little bit different, and this is where the difficulty comes in putting together packaged products or collective investments for the ESG world. Is it doesn't really allow you to customize it to everyone's unique preferences. So we've developed an ESG investment solution that works for both US and UK tax. It works for both US and UK tax reporting, which again, we went on a minute ago of how difficult and how important that is just to make your advisor's life sane and not insane. But then also is customizable to what you want it to be, whether that's, again, an extreme concern about the climate and the fact that ice caps are melting, or whether it's LGBTQ plus concerns and what companies are considering that in their own hiring and professional practices, or whether that's really how much do companies give back to wider society as a whole. And that's something we see a lot of. And in fact, on the governance side, you can really look at a company's DNA and start to understand how they're governing themselves. So Wells Fargo had a well-publicized scandal, 4 or 5 years ago, where they unnecessarily opened accounts without client permission, and just opened, tens and dozens and scores of accounts for clients who were then turning around and their credit scores were impacted and they didn't realize they had all these accounts. And the tax man saying, well, what about the interest in this account? Or, where did that come from? Say, well, I don't have any other accounts. I only have one account at Wells Fargo. Turns out they had 7. So, what were the internal practices that allowed them to meet these internal sales goals, to just open up empty accounts? And were there any risk controls or governance controls at Wells Fargo, 4 or 5 years ago? I know that they've taken a lot of time to address those as one particular example. Another being, the well-publicized Volkswagen's emissions scandal, where they intentionally created software to defeat the emissions detection devices inside the car, whether you were on an emissions detector, like an MOT type of machine here in the UK, or whether you're just riding on the highway. And if you're on the MOT testing machine, it turned down the emissions to the acceptable levels. And if you're on the highway, it just turned them right back up to get maximum performance. What was the internal culture and governance at Volkswagen that allowed that to happen? So these are really quite interconnected and really important issues for not just American connected families, but really for everyone.
Does that then mean, Patrick, that the good news takeaway from this is that an American thinking about sort of prudent investing doesn't need to think about restricted investing, that there are still the opportunities to be ethical in their investing strategy, while also being tax and reporting efficient in both countries?
Yeah, absolutely. Ethical, social, governance, all these ESG factors should be encouraging a positive framework where really you're encouraging companies that have set out to proactively do things to improve the performance of the company, not just do the right thing because of the moral implications, which are important, but proactively reward companies that are setting themselves up for strong future performance because they're also promoting important things internally, like diversity and promotion internally, like trying to do the right thing by not cheating laws and systems and moral issues. If you are promoting that, you are working on the idea that should give you outperformance over time, or at least be able to tightly track what you're trying to invest in, rather than sacrificing performance because you're excluding investments.
Yeah, completely. I'm sure that will come of a great relief to what is presumably an increasingly large section of society that chooses to be ethical with their money and make their money work for them both financially, but also on a moral level.
And I think to your prior point, American connected households really don't have to give up anything in the financial sense. It might take a bit of a specialist knowledge. It might take a bit more focus on the issues. It might take a bit more concentration to make it optimal and efficient, but there are answers and there are solutions, and you don't have to give up anything by being an American connected household.
Fantastic. I'm sure a great reassurance to all Americans in the UK. Turning to what I have sort of labeled as products, you might not call them products, the sorts of things that Americans and indeed, high net worth individuals generally are thinking about, that form some of the linchpins of financial planning. I had identified, or I thought in my own perhaps naive view, what happens when I retire and how do I bring my kids up the ladder with me are two of the things that financial planning focuses very heavily on, which brings in pensions and brings in saving for the next generation. How do you go about having that discussion with people about what they need to save, and how do you, particularly in the US UK sphere, how do you decide, well, this client, you have an occupational pension in the UK, or you've got an old 401k in the US, you should or shouldn't have an IRA, or you've inherited an IRA and you should be drawing down over time or not. What does that discussion look like on the pensions side? What do people need to know, and how do you guide them through? I mean, pensions are few people's favorite topics outside of the financial planning world, I imagine. So breaking down some misnomers is probably one of your first jobs, is it not?
It is. And pensions, such a short word, covers so many different things. So if you're living in the US right now and thinking about moving to the UK, you might be thinking that we're talking about defined benefit pensions where you're going to get a payment for the rest of your life. If you're deep into the culture of the UK, you've probably gotten used to calling every retirement account in both sides of the Atlantic, like your old 401k, a pension, because that's what's called over here in the UK. So one word does cover a whole lot of things. It's a broad topic. Certainly there are people that come to us with, as you say, inherited IRAs, and that's an entirely different wing where we're going to want to sit down with people and talk about what the rules on inheriting an IRA are, who left it to you, what the time frame was for when you inherited it, and what rules need to be followed to carry that through. For many people, they're going to come to us having built up some combination of their own retirement plans. So perhaps some 401ks and IRAs, and maybe even if they've done some proactive work to set up some Roth IRAs back in the US. There are some combinations of different vehicles that are available back in the US. And usually those have been funded from time working inside of the US. Not always, but usually that's the route into that. And similarly, often we're going to be working with clients who have already come over to the UK and are investing inside of a pension wrapper, if for no other reason than because it's widely available through their employment. So most people who've been here and working here in the UK for some period of time have built up some funds inside of a pension wrapper, a UK pension, I mean. And thinking about those two different types of accounts, but who still have broadly the same structure, right? Outside of the Roth IRA I mentioned briefly, both the traditional US qualified account like a 401k or an IRA and a UK pension or SIP or personal pension all work off the basic idea that this is tax deferred, not tax free. You're putting in money that isn't taxed today whenever you're contributing it to the account. You're letting it grow tax deferred. And eventually the rules in both countries are going to be that you're allowed to take out that money with some combination of income tax rates applied with some special rules we can go into if that's of interest later on. So both do line up quite nicely, which is one advantage from financial planning's perspective, is that you're dealing with accounts that have roughly the same rules and are often recognized in the dual tax treaty between the two countries.
I was just going to piggyback off of that to say I've always found pensions is a very good example of where the US and the UK sort of come close together with their alignment as far as tax is concerned, and then they kind of diverge at the end. So exactly as you pointed out, Patrick, the US-UK double tax treaty has an entire article on pensions that gets you half of the way there, that says, well, if you are an American living in the UK and you've got a UK pension, then this is the way in which that the pension distributions are going to be taxed. This is the country that's going to have the first bite of the cherry. This is the country that won't, and so on and so forth. And that works in vanilla circumstances. However, Kristopher, you will no doubt have experienced many times over, those rules can quickly get distorted, and there are almost more exceptions to the rule than the rule itself, particularly when you come to think about not just basic things that I am going to refer to as a pension, like a defined benefit or an occupational pension, but you start to talk about things like IRAs, and then it starts to get a bit murkier.
Absolutely. And really understanding those rules is key to find that optimal and efficient solution. Do you make contributions? Which spouse makes the contributions? If you have one spouse that's in the 45% tax bracket, it might make sense for them to contribute, although they might be capped out or tapered out or close to the lifetime allowance in the UK. Are there ways to gift money to the other spouse potentially so they can make larger catch-up contributions in their pension? And really trying to understand, to use the pension for most people to understand how to pay the lowest lifetime average tax rate on the pension and earned income that they might have. And for many of our high earning clients, it's just difficult because pensions become an extremely small part of the plan. And really you start looking at how do you structure the family, whether it's trusts or whether it's family limited partnerships or whether it's some other slightly more exotic structure that actually will do a lot more, get you a lot further along the optimal and efficient scale than just talking about pensions would. So it really depends on each family's unique circumstances.
The problem that any person living in another country has, but particularly for Americans being taxed on their citizenship on a worldwide basis, is that you don't just have to worry about the tax rules in one country changing. You have to worry about the tax rules in either country changing. So, as at the date of recording, there is a suggestion by the UK authorities that pension tax relief is going to be reduced and made less generous. Putting aside the policy decision as to whether that's a good idea or not, that's a problem for most British people because that affects the tax efficiency of a pension. But of course, for an American, you only need to get one of the rules to change, and you're always going to end up paying tax at the higher rate in one jurisdiction or the other because you'll only ever get a credit for the amount paid in the other. So it's particularly fraught, is it not, dealing with these rules with an American, because you've got to have an eye in different directions, one on Mr. Biden's administration and one on Mr. Johnson's administration, and asking them, if you're going to move, please move at the same time. Don't one move and one stay. That's the worst of all worlds sometimes.
And as we saw at the G7 conference the other day, even when you get them together in a room, they don't listen to each other and they don't want to move in the same direction at the same time. So really the best you can hope for is to be nimble and be aware of what's changing, which usually does involve being pretty actively involved with following the rules. And that creates a common pitfall that people can fall into where in this 21st century, it's almost the default that when someone has a question, they're going to go look it up online. They're going to try and see what the correct treatment is for a question or a rule. And it's always difficult in any circumstance to really know that the advice being given is from an expert or an authority or even someone who knows what they're talking about in the first place. But with the speed with which both countries change their rules, which is reasonably often, almost every tax year, you can expect some important change. What might be particularly great advice, if it was written in 2017 or 2018, might have some key things that are out of date. So getting that up-to-date advice as things change is really key and important to have a team of people in place to give you it, because there's a lot of different rules that can change.
And in fact, that's why we named the firm Tanager. It's a nod or an homage to Darwin and natural selection and evolution, because it's really difficult to say this, but we know that the advice we give today will probably be wrong in 5 years' time. Something will have changed underneath of us. There'll be some seismic shift, as you mentioned, in the Biden or Johnson administration, so that maybe capital gains rates go one direction in one country, but not in the other country, or something happens with pension tax relief or something to that effect. And you really have to stay on top of it and keep your financial plan and your family's plan as kind of a living document, as opposed to a static set it and forget it, because that's not going to work. Even if you've done all the research and figured it out today, it's probably wrong in 3 or 4 years, and you really have to stay on top of it.
That I'm afraid is the consequence of living, of living within the boundaries of the rules, and particularly in the middle of the slim Venn diagram that is US and UK tax and estate planning. You will inevitably be found in one jurisdiction or the other on the wrong side of the matters, and so you do have to stay quite nimble and quite quick to keep on top of things.
UK, USA, tax talk and more from Collyer, Bristow.
Let's assume pensions have all been sorted. We've waved a magic wand and pensions are now done. I don't know if you've ever got to say to a client that pensions are now done, but let's assume that they don't have to worry about any more of their pensions now. And they're now thinking about Mr. Jones have these 2 small children. They're minors. They've got, let's say they've got good 15 years before they reach maturity or, get out the other end of university and start making a life for themselves. So Mr. and Mrs. Jones still have a good few years left looking after them, but they want to start setting them up in life. My own impression of this world is that with my sort of raised in the UK hat on, I know that there are things like junior ISAs that you can open as a parent for your children, and it's all wonderful and great. And lots of people will go down to the bank and they will do that. If I've known anything about being an American in the UK, it's that what's good for a British person is not necessarily what's good for an American. And the same is true vice versa. What works for an American in America might not work for them in the UK. Isn't that right, Kristopher?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's something that we face every single day. We probably have scores of junior ISAs on the books, none of which we've recommended clients open, but they come to us having opened them, perhaps talking to the neighbor or the grandparent or whomever, the bank teller manager, and said, oh, you should have a junior ISA for your child, put money away every year, it's tax-free. Fantastic, excepting the IRS doesn't really recognize the ISA wrapper at all. So you might actually have some tax challenges inside of that ISA wrapper. And this is one of the questions that we get a lot, and really understanding the best intentions, because everyone wants to take care of the children. I don't think there's many parents who don't want to take care of children, or grandparents that want to help out their grandchildren, over their lifetime, whether it's school fees or down payment on a flat or whatever it might be. It's understanding the proper ways that you can do it. Because in the similar vein, the 529 plans, which are a college savings plan in the US, and quite common for many families to save for eventual college needs, or just any general educational needs for their children, are not really recognized by the HMRC. So you have the challenge on the other side of the Atlantic. And something that I've experienced also is looking at the grandparents in one country or the other just default to setting up what all of their peers have set up for their grandchildren, such as 529s or junior ISAs. And in particular here, a lot of trusts and putting money in trust, but not realizing what a foreign grantor trust might be to the IRS. And in fact, now you've definitely set the child up for some challenges, tax or otherwise. And you need to have some really difficult conversations, perhaps with other generations, about how they're doing their own intergenerational planning and what that looks like, which I appreciate can be difficult to have. Not everyone wants to tell their children or grandchildren how much money they have or what they're planning on helping them with or not helping them with. But to be efficient and make sure the money's not just given away as tax penalties, sometimes those conversations really need to be had.
I certainly find that as a UK estate planning lawyer, and I don't even come with the benefit you guys have of being US qualified. If I have a client who's come to the UK, or we have families that have come to the UK, but the family's multi-generational planning is still US driven because this is the only part of the family that's in the UK, then you find yourself sometimes slightly out on, quite far out on the limb of the branch, saying, I don't want to interpose, but there's something we need to do to this planning to make this planning more efficient in the UK for this section of the family. But you find yourself up against, the wider momentum of the planning that works in the US. Let's say, Mrs. Jones has her father who has planned for his 3 or 4 children, but 3 of whom still live in the US, and this planning needs to work for them. And you can't be the advisor who comes storming in like a bull in a china shop and says, actually, I'll have you know, this is what would work really great for us in the UK. If he says, well, that's great, but I'm an American, I'm in America, I've got American assets, and I've been doing this for a long time. We're not just going to upset the apple cart because my daughter's moved to the UK for 10 years. Let's think about this more carefully. I imagine it is exactly the same with you guys. You want to sort of suggest amendments or suggest ways in which these things can be done more efficiently, but without a way that's going to either upset the apple cart from a reporting sense, or indeed deal with the client's emotional sort of, issues with having their plan torn up and told, no, this is not good enough. We need to do something different.
It's always good to have that conversation with clients to make sure that your financial plan is presented in a way that you're not moving too far from their comfort zone, for sure. I think that the key difference perhaps from the estate planning world and what you're discussing there with trying to fit into an existing plan that is perhaps tied to a very large family and has many, many, many moving parts back in the US. And this really is just one small part of the family that's resident here in the UK, is that typically, being US and UK dual qualified, we are trying to come in and present a unified plan here and say, as politely as possible, while you may have had things set up very often back in the US that made perfect sense when in the US, whether that's municipal bonds that are tax-free in the US, but not tax-free here in the UK, and therefore basically just underperforming bonds. Or if you've even perhaps got a portfolio chock full of tax inefficient investments that are subject to penalty rates of taxation, you do need to say it politely, and you do need to say it in a way that the client is going to be on board with. But eventually you are coming up with a new plan, I think. You aren't necessarily trying to completely fit in with the prior arrangement. Usually you're trying to say there are enough fundamental problems here that it's really worth redoing this to start from a position where you're going to have a clean bill of health going forward. And that means perhaps changing quite a bit of the plan that was set up back in the US before you moved to the UK, before you ever knew what the HMRC was or all the different tax rules that come from being abroad.
I remember someone saying to me once, and if it was either of you, you should certainly take credit. And if it wasn't you, this is where you take credit. That financial planning and investment management in this respect is about saying, there are 5 doors that are open here, and you can walk through any one of these doors, and they're all going to be good for you. And these are 5 options. Don't walk through those doors over there. But the US UK planning is about saying, well, I'm just going to shut 2 of these doors without telling you. They're not going to work for you because you're an American. You've still got 3 doors left. They're still going to work for you, but just don't go through those doors that a non-American might still also be able to walk through. Behind door number 1 is an ISA. Behind door number 2 is XYZ. But you've still got these 3 really good opportunities that will still work for you. They're not going to be a problem in America because they still work just fine. And it's about narrowing the choice of what still works and just politely steering them away from those things that they didn't want to get involved with anyway, despite what the man down the pub told them.
That's absolutely right. And it is kind of narrowing the choice in the kind of paternalistic libertarianism of, everyone has rights and you have free will and you can choose what you like, but we're strongly going to recommend these 3 doors. These 2 doors over there, we don't have the key, actually. We really don't want you to walk through that door. You could probably hire a locksmith, but we're not going to facilitate that. These 3 doors are really where we're going to guide you.
I'm sensing the kind of the classic sort of Darren Brown illusionist opportunity where you've got 3 envelopes on the table and you're saying you can have free choice of any one of these envelopes while subtly, pushing one envelope towards them, going, take the hint. Like my 20 years in the industry is recommending you take envelope number 1. You are allowed to take envelopes 2 or 3, but my strong recommendation is that you take envelope number 1.
Absolutely. We did this very, very recently with a client who inherited a large trust from his parents who had passed away, unfortunately. And the local bank had become the trustee, as is quite common in the US. And we had a long calls with the bank, and we said, look, here are the three things that we don't want you to do. Number one, put all the cash into a money market fund, because that might be bad for HMRC purposes. Just leave it on deposit. You're a bank. You should be able to keep the money on deposit as opposed to sweeping it into a money market fund. Number two, please stick to these types of investments. We give them a long list of, this is what you can invest in. Here's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of options, but there's thousands that you probably shouldn't be, kind of to your door analogy. And number three, they really need to look at how do we use an LLC inside of the trust to control certain things, but to make sure that that LLC is not controlled from the UK. And here are some things that we understand work. And in fact, the client they themselves found a UK attorney who understood these types of challenges and worked quite well with understanding the rules around LLCs in America. First thing the bank did, they swept all the money into a money market fund on day one. Luckily, we caught it within a week and said, oh, well, we noticed on your statement it's in fund ABC. Can we set up another call? Because I thought we had said, let's keep this on deposit to avoid any HMRC problems. Number two, they had a portfolio presentation that had many, many things that were off of the list that we had given them that was kind of restricted down to the 3 doors they could walk through. And number three, they were going to appoint someone in the UK, or they're going to allow someone in the UK to manage the LLC that had various property and real estate concerns inside of it. And we said, really, guys, let's get this UK attorney back on the phone and let's go through this. If you don't believe us, that's fine. But here's a tax attorney. They're going to tell you, this is what you need to know. And again, as Patrick said, it's really about doing it as politely and as collaboratively as possible, without just saying, look, this is what you need to do.
And I think that's a really good segue. I've got one eye on the time and how much time we have available today. One eye on, though, the final thing I wanted to discuss with you guys, which Kristopher, you teed up really nicely, which is sort of common pitfalls and things you wish people didn't do, and/or things people should watch out for. I imagine number one on the list is, when we give advice, is please politely follow the advice. Is number one. Don't walk through door number 3 if we've told you not to walk through door number 3. Yeah, don't hire the locksmith to break through it. I'm thinking about this being a sort of a really good takeaway for people listening to this. What are the things that are the most problematic when they come to you? What are things that people do that if they can get their house in order beforehand is helpful, or the misconceptions people have? From my perspective, and I know I've talked with Patrick about this before, I imagine, like with a lawyer, come to us before the problem starts. So if you're coming to the UK, come to us before you come to the UK, because there'll be things we can do for you while you're still in America and outside the UK tax net. And then number two, I wonder whether the other thing that you guys sometimes come up against is, I didn't know I was an American. Or more importantly, oh, my child's not an American. Actually, your child is an American, because despite what the previous US administration pushed against, it's actually quite easy to be found an American, or to be an American from birth, because you have parentage that automatically gives you citizenship, and thus you have someone who doesn't realize that they're an American and should have been investing efficiently for them. Are those some of the things you see, and/or what are some of the other things that the pitfalls that clients make that you think, if only they knew this, they could probably cause themselves later headaches and their advisors headaches as well?
Yeah, and I think you probably know very well what it's like to find out that you're an American citizen and perhaps not exactly expecting it, since you've lived your whole life abroad.
That's fine. I was born in America, and I had an American passport from birth, so that's absolutely fine. I was under no illusion. My mother had an American accent, so there was no doubt in my mind. But there will be lots of people out there who don't know they're Americans because their parents are American.
Well, the biggest thing is probably just to understand the concept of full disclosure. So when we sit down with someone for the first time, we do have a list of questions, and we can pair them back as we have a discussion. But there's probably 60 or 70 questions that we're going to ask or get to the answers. If question number 7 is no, then we don't need to answer that. Ask the next 5. But if we ask if you have an ISA, don't say in the back of your mind, oh yes, well, I have a junior ISA, but it's tax free. I don't need to tell them about the junior ISA. I don't want them to manage it or touch it. It's fine. My mother set it up. My British mother set it up. It's fine. I don't need to tell Tanager about that, or my tax accountant, or my tax attorney. That's fine. Actually, you need to tell us. We need to understand, and at least start to understand the scope of any challenges that you might have unwittingly fallen into, whether it is ISAs in Britain or 529 plans in America, again, which are very, very common things, which most everyone has in either country, but don't quite work for the other country. So I would say the biggest pitfall is really just not full disclosure. And if you're hiring us or hiring Collyer, Bristow are hiring, anyone for their advice, well, you should really be open and honest and try to get the most out of what you're spending on that advice, because it's going to be good advice.
I mean, if you took your car into the garage to get a service and the guy said, is anything wrong with the car? And you thought, well, I mean, it's making this really weird noise, but I won't tell him that because it's making a really weird noise for 15 years. It's a lot easier to say to the mechanic, it's got this noise, and he say, oh, that's no problem, don't worry, than assume it doesn't need to be sorted. Full disclosure to any advisor is always going to be useful, because we're much more comfortable with the full picture than with half the story. Patrick, any other sort of things that you wish clients knew or you wish they could do before they came to you?
There's many things that they could do, but I'd say that on a high level, it would be a case of perhaps they focus too much on the strategies before they come to us instead of focusing on the goals. And I think that if someone can articulate their own goals, as an American living here in the UK, you're going to be able to achieve just about any goal you set. You just may not be able to use the strategy that your neighbors do. You may not be able to use, 3 of those 5 doors, to quote the analogy you've been using for the last 10 minutes. But if you're really focused on getting to where you want to be and achieving what's important to you and your family, that's still achievable, even with the dual US-UK exposure. It's just about letting us come to you with strategies and advice and focus on the important things that animate you as a person and animate you as a family.
I couldn't think of a nicer way to end this episode than exactly on that. Come to us with your goals and your wishes, and we make your dreams come true. I mean, what more of a
how Disney-like?
Yeah, exactly. What more of a nice tone to end on is there than that? Patrick, Kristopher, thank you so much for coming along today. Again, Patrick Mulhern, Kristopher Heck from Tanager Wealth Management. If you have any questions, I am sure a very quick Google of their firm or of them will bring them up. Equally, I've been Aidan Grant. If you have any questions, you've probably found this podcast through our website or some other avenue. And again, you can find us on the internet. Thank you very much. We'll be back in the future with another episode. And in the meantime, have a lovely afternoon.